Welcome to the Rebuild Procurement podcast, where we dive deep into topics to keep procurement people up to date and ahead of their peers. Subscribe on YouTube, whether you like this or not. It could be YouTube, it could be Spotify, Apple, wherever you're listening. On today's episode, so this is a solo episode. Alan's off doing something seemingly more fun. And what we're going to go through today is we're going to call this type of pod the story of. And today we're going to do the story of Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, I'm Tom Finn, bringing 15 years on the client side, procurement, finance, and category management experience in large and small cap orgs. And Alan Veek, our procurement geek, he'll be back next week. So why Sarbanes-Oxley? Why did I decide I wanted to talk about this? What could be more boring, process-oriented thing at private companies? One of the reasons with all this DOGE stuff happening, it got me thinking of, all right, what's the difference between private industry and government, and just the world of government and what that is. And I became curious again. We've all worked with SOX. If you're at a public company, this is something that you have to deal with from a process perspective all the time. People kind of just throw it out there. And I thought it was helpful to go back for two reasons. One, to reacquaint yourself. This was something from 2002, why it exists, because it's still very pertinent today. And then also, how could we consider this as applicable to government? It's something that's sometimes seen as overbearing, costly, but it was done for a reason, and that reason was good at the time. So let's dive into it. So put yourself, pre-2000. So what is happening at that time? You have the dot-com boom, life is good, money being thrown all over the place. People couldn't be more happy. There was these rock star CEOs. Money was cheap. Wall Street doing whatever it wanted at the time. And then you had CEOs, some of the names you may remember. One, Jeffrey Skilling, Enron. Bernie Ebbers, WorldCom. Dennis Kozlowski, Tyco. These guys, amongst all that, that money being floated all over the place, they started gaming the system. They had this mentality of greed is good, expansion, doing all this stuff. And scandals began to unfold. So the first most well-known, I'm not even sure if it was the first, but the most well-known is Enron, the smartest guys in the room, right? So they were this energy trading empire. They're essentially built on debt that they hid and inflated profits. And as well as, when you put those together, if you're hiding stuff and you're inflating something else, you look fantastic. And they were the darling. They were a darling of Wall Street. They were ranked number 7 on the Fortune 500 in 2001. So today, if you kind of just mirror the number, that's where Exxon Mobil sits today. So imagine Exxon Mobil going through something like this. At the time, they had about $100 billion in revenue, employed 20,000 people, and they started faking things. So they faked their profits. They did this mark-to-market accounting, jiggery. So they did that. They booked future profits on deals the day of that they were signed. So if it was a $1 million deal, they said, all right, that's my $1 million, even if the money never came in. So it's illegal. And then if a deal was lost, they just decided not to report it. And then their auditors were also just not very good. So they would go through, they were kind of, for lack of a better term, in bed with them. They were shredding documents when things came about. So absolute mess. Then you had WorldCom. They faked billions of dollars in revenue. Tyco, their CEO, this is he had like a $6,000 shower curtain. I think he had like a golden toilet seat. And then another one was Adelphia, where they were also just treating they were a cable company back in the early 2000s, and they were just treating the money like a personal piggy bank versus investors' money. People putting money into the company to get a return. They were instead using that for themselves. And then, at first, no one suspected a thing, but then whistleblowers start coming about. You have investigations, and this house of cards that these folks have built starts to collapse. And really, that's when the bubble was bursting at the time in the tech area, and then you have all of these guys that seem like good, valuable companies, right? They're energy companies, cable companies. They're also, people are realizing that these guys have just taken advantage of the system. So what they realize, they start having folks come in, they're going through all these things. There's a few things. The auditors had conflicts of interest. So Arthur Andersen was the one for Enron. And this was pertinent throughout the corporate sector at the time. They'd be their auditor, right? The one that's responsible for making sure everything's clean so that investors are comfortable with the numbers they're being shown. But then you also have them doing consulting for millions of dollars and doing these other things, tax loss, all this other stuff. So basically they would get embedded within the organization, and then those mishaps that they start creating, they're also theirs. So hence Arthur Andersen shredding documents. Boardrooms also completely didn't help here, especially the audit committees. So they failed to exercise their oversight, lacked expertise. They're kind of just there rubber stamping things. Securities analysts also had conflicts of interest. So those that would issue the buy and sell recommendations. They had relationships with the investment banking companies. And then the last one I have here is just inadequate funding of the SEC. So the Security and Exchange Commission, they are the ones that have to enforce all these laws. They were underfunded at the time, so they weren't able to keep up with these corporate folks that are flush with money. So with that, you have two folks that enter the scene in 2002. One gentleman, Senator Paul Sarbanes, and then Representative Michael Oxley. So hence Sarbanes-Oxley. So these two gentlemen, they come together. Sarbanes, he was the one that was more low profile, but he had a deep understanding of corporate governance. So he really was one of these folks that, he had a legal background, and he appreciated the corporate governance and financial oversight side of thing. And the other gentleman, Michael Oxley, he was actually one that appreciated the loosening of financial rules, and he did that within the 1990s. That's what he had supported. But with all of this craziness happening, he was the one that kind of entered in and said, that other side of reason. Later on, he maybe felt that he pushed it a little too far, but these two are the folks that pushed it through, and it went through the Senate. What they passed, or what they were pushing, went through the Senate, got approved 99-0, and in the House in the United States, 423-3. So it was a very popular bipartisan thing to get these corporate folks under control. Now there was fallout, from corporate America, from all of this. So just to give some of around the investigations and things that went on. So, like I was saying, there was fraud discovered through these financial analysts, journalists. There was whistleblowers. Sharon Watkins was the person that might be familiar name regarding the Enron trial. Then Arthur Andersen had very minimal, they collapsed actually as an outcome of this. So they were an audit company that didn't audit well and fell apart overnight. But then with all of this, there was also public outrage because of like the Enrons of the world. You have 20,000 people. They have pensions tied up in the company. They got wiped out as well as stockholders. So then what was put into this 99-0, 423 to 3 or 4 or whatever I'd said? What were the big pieces that came from Sarbanes-Oxley that actually you probably think of just as generally accepted practice now because it's been around so long? So the first was that they put a public company accounting oversight board. They call it the PCAOB. So this is an independent company. They get everything approved through the SEC. So any rules they have that change, They get approved by the SEC first. But they have this board, they're independent oversight. Couldn't find if they're funded by the government or not, but they're called an independent oversight board. So they oversee the audits of all the public companies. And the idea is to protect investors and as well as the public interest. The auditor independence was number 2. So with that, the Arthur Andersons of the world, those type companies, so the Deloittes and these others, they would split what they were doing, right? So they couldn't, if you're doing the board audits, you can't also do other things within the company that can have that conflict of interest. You have to be very away from those conflicts. The corporate responsibility, this is a big one. This was a big one because CEOs and CFOs, they now need to personally, with their guarantee, that they have to certify that the accuracy of the company's financials, that they are accurate. So it's very important. That was a very important piece because it gives that liability associated with it. One, and this is the one that affected procurement folks and internal finance folks at organizations, the internal controls for financial reporting. So think about that. I know when I joined the workforce, it was just a few years past 2002, but it was one thing where the procurement was much more involved, right? There's these multi-steps. You have a requester and you have many other approvers within a PO cycle for many companies. Those weren't always there. You could, in the past, have a requester and just pay, right? It wasn't as big of a deal. So with that, there was, more fraud that can happen. And with some extra approvals, you're not necessarily going through and just, paying off a buddy with a requisition that gets paid immediately. Because those things could happen historically, but the internal controls became much more important. Then they have additional financial disclosures that they have to make, like these off-balance sheet things that happen, material changes, they need to call them out that they didn't need to necessarily do before. And then the last one I had here was whistleblower protection. So after Sarbanes-Oxley, you couldn't, if someone was to do whistleblowing on your organization, in the past they would fear retaliation. So there was put into place through Sarbanes-Oxley, you can't retaliate against somebody. So they could do it without fear of retaliation and essentially losing their job. Now, that's all great and good. There's tough stuff that happened, right? The compliance costs, it looked like on average, companies need to spend about $1 million to keep up with SOX alone, Sarbanes-Oxley alone. Now, if you're a smaller company, it can be anywhere from around $200K to larger companies like anywhere from $2 to $5 million. But these are costly line items to go through these audits every year, not just hiring the audit company, but supporting the audits and putting all these things in place. The corporate governance side of things, this was a positive, but there's additional audit committees and you have this additional oversight of your financial reporting and the audit process itself. And then just really that accountability, like you have to do some more financial reports, but the accountability was the one here, the additional one here, where the CEOs and the CFOs need to sign off. And then investors, and really one of the main things was just to restore investor confidence within investors, right? So you have companies like falling apart at the seams. Who else is overstating revenues and overstating income? These things were put into place to make investors feel more comfortable and also give greater protection to the extent that folks were whistleblowers. Now, as the effectiveness, there was like a decrease in, odd, abnormal, they would say, accruals, and then improved internal controls and investor confidence was increased. But there were criticisms. I mentioned the money and the administrative burden, like time associated with this. They felt possibly like reduced risk taking. to be seen. Not sure if that is actually a negative one that was negatively affected in the long term. But one thing that is possible still is it does affect the IPO market. There's a lot more stringency when you go list publicly, and a lot of that is associated with the Sarbanes-Oxley. But why am I talking about this? So these things and these audits, they go through, and there are things that companies do very regularly. It's for the health of, again, the investors and the company. And I see there's a lot of criticism on this going forward with the government, and it just feels like this is a good thing. A lot of folks are investors in the government who want to run efficiently, effectively, and I think just these audits, I've partaken in a lot of them. Right, there's like these P2P things. They're good practices to have, and I think this is a helpful, recollection on the importance of it for the private sector. And then that just using the same exact criteria from private to public feels like a decent starting point. I think there's probably room for a Sarbanes-Oxley 2.0 that can, given it's been around for over 20 years now, can really revise and see what's worked well, what hasn't, upgrade certain things, maybe put more in place and maybe less in place in other spots. But I think it's good to reflect and see why we do things. In this case, Sarbanes-Oxley, it was born out of, folks doing bad things, and it reduced a lot of that. So I think it'll be interesting to see where a lot of this goes. And yeah, let's see if this one clicks or not. This Sarbanes-Oxley, and this the story of segment we have here. So we'll come back with the regular scheduled programming next week. And have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining us on the Rebuild Procurement podcast. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest procurement content.
Show me, and you won't hear the word rebuild.